He thought his wealth made him untouchable. He thought his words were just sharp jokes tossed into the air, not blades that cut through a man's dignity. But arrogance has a strange way of collapsing, especially when the world is watching. Marcus had worked at Harrington and Company for nearly 3 years. He arrived before sunrise, leaving long after the city's skyline had turned violet and cold. He was diligent, precise, and ambitious. His colleagues admired his work, though they rarely invited him for drinks after hours. Sometimes he wondered if it was because he was quiet or because he was black. That question hovered in his mind like a shadow he tried to ignore, until the day Mr. Richard Harrington himself answered it for him in the cruelest way possible. Richard Harrington was the kind of man who loved his own voice. His empire had been built on old money, inherited networks, and the sharp ability to humiliate others in a boardroom. His confidence was not born of struggle but of entitlement, polished by generations of privilege. When he walked into a room, people straightened their backs not out of respect but fear. That morning, the golden light pouring into the high-rise windows made him look like a king. The meeting was supposed to be simple: quarterly results, team updates, and a few projections. Marcus had prepared his report carefully, double-checking every figure until his eyes burned. It was his first time presenting in front of Harrington himself, and though nerves pulsed through him, he was determined to prove his worth. As he clicked through his slides, the room remained still, except for the scratching of pens. Then, as he concluded, silence filled the boardroom until Harrington leaned back in his leather chair, his lips curling into a smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Well," Harrington drawled, his voice heavy with amusement, "you're surprisingly articulate for someone like you." The words sliced the air, cutting deeper than any blade. For a moment, Marcus thought he had misheard. The executives exchanged awkward glances, some shifting in their seats, some staring at the table as though it had suddenly become fascinating. Harrington chuckled and added, "Not bad. You've clearly learned how to speak proper English. Must have taken some effort." The blood in Marcus's veins turned to fire. He wanted to respond, to say something sharp enough to pierce the smug armor of the man across from him. But years of swallowing pain, years of telling himself to pick his battles, chained his tongue. His silence, however, only fueled Harrington's arrogance. "Gentlemen," Harrington said, turning to the rest of the board, "this is what I call progress. See, anyone can be trained, given enough patience. Even someone from less fortunate origins." He smirked, his words dripping with condescension, with the poison of centuries of prejudice hidden in polished corporate language. Marcus felt his chest tighten, the air in the room growing heavy. He caught the sympathetic gaze of Clara, one of the few colleagues who had always treated him with respect. Her eyes burned with the same indignation that swelled inside him. Yet still, Marcus said nothing, because he knew something Harrington did not. 2 weeks earlier, Marcus had filed a quiet but determined complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He had endured whispers, microaggressions, and backhanded compliments for years, but Harrington's behavior had grown bolder, crueler, impossible to ignore. He had gathered emails, meeting transcripts, even recordings where Harrington's words dripped with disdain. And though he knew it would be a battle, Marcus had promised himself he would fight not just for his dignity, but for every colleague too afraid to speak. That day in the boardroom, Harrington believed he had crushed Marcus. In truth, he had only handed Marcus the final piece of evidence he needed. By the following week, the walls of Harrington's empire began to tremble. The lawsuit arrived like thunder, a federal case built not only on Marcus's testimony, but on the voices of others Harrington had dismissed, belittled, and mocked. Former employees, contractors, even junior partners stepped forward. Each story wove into a tapestry of arrogance and cruelty, painted in unmistakable detail. At first, Harrington laughed. He called it a witch hunt, a desperate attempt by jealous underlings to tarnish his name. His lawyers promised to bury Marcus under paperwork and legal jargon, to drag the case until exhaustion forced him to surrender. But something shifted. The public caught wind. News outlets published articles with titles that glowed like fire. CEO faces federal discrimination suit. Systemic racism in corporate power. Protests gathered outside the Harrington Tower, voices rising, chanting for justice under the glare of camera lenses. Suddenly, Harrington's golden light no longer made him look like a king. It made him look exposed, like a man on a pedestal crumbling under the weight of truth. The trial became a theater of reckoning. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, steady though the weight of history pressed against him. Across the room, Harrington smirked, confident his money could twist the truth. But money could not erase the recordings. Money could not silence witnesses who trembled as they spoke of years of humiliation. Money could not rewrite the sneer in his voice as he mocked Marcus in front of the board. Each day peeled back another layer of Harrington's empire, revealing rot beneath the marble. And with each revelation, Marcus felt both vindication and sorrow. He had not wanted to become a symbol, but here he was, carrying centuries of struggle into a courtroom bathed in harsh white light. Then came the moment no one expected. During cross-examination, Harrington was cornered. The attorney asked him plainly, "Do you believe African Americans are less capable than others?" Harrington chuckled, attempting charm, but his arrogance betrayed him. "Well," he said, shrugging, "the numbers speak for themselves, don't they? We have to work harder to polish them. That's just reality." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. The jury's eyes hardened, their patience evaporated. In that single moment, Harrington had condemned himself. By the time the verdict arrived, the weight of the federal government pressed firmly against him. Guilty of discrimination, guilty of violating civil rights laws. The sentence was not just financial penalties or forced reforms. It was humiliation, public, undeniable, irreversible. Reporters swarmed as Harrington exited the courthouse, his face pale, his steps unsteady. Cameras flashed as questions rained down. "Do you regret your words? Do you apologize? Will you step down?" And then, the image that would forever define him. Harrington, collapsing to his knees on the courthouse steps, begging for forgiveness. The golden sunlight did not crown him this time. It burned him, illuminating his downfall for the world to see. Marcus watched from a distance, not with triumph, but with quiet strength. Because the battle was never about destroying Harrington. It was about proving that dignity, once stolen, could be reclaimed. That justice, though slow, could still blaze like fire. The world would remember that day, not for Harrington's arrogance, but for the man who refused to let it stand. The courthouse steps still echoed with Harrington's collapse. For the world, it was the perfect picture of justice. A titan brought low, arrogance scorched by the very light he once believed illuminated only him. Yet for Marcus, the image stirred a storm he could not name. Watching a man kneel did not heal the wounds left by years of silence, nor did it erase the faces of those who had been crushed by the same system long before him. Justice had spoken, but its voice trembled with unfinished sentences. That night, Marcus sat alone in his small apartment, the city buzzing outside his window. His phone overflowed with messages, friends congratulating him, strangers hailing him as a hero, journalists begging for interviews. But Marcus stared at the ceiling, the hollow quiet pressing in. He thought of his father, a man who had driven buses for 30 years and endured insults with a clenched jaw. He thought of his mother, who told him to keep his head high even when the world tried to push it down. He thought of every ancestor who had been forced to swallow rage, their stories buried in shadows. And he wondered, had today been enough? The next morning, Harrington's empire cracked further. Stock prices plummeted, investors fled, and the board of directors, once loyal lapdogs, turned their fangs on him. Headlines painted him as the face of corporate racism, his once pristine reputation now a cautionary tale. Still, Harrington raged. He gave an interview on a conservative network, claiming he was the victim of reverse discrimination, insisting the lawsuit had been a political attack. His words dripped with bitterness, but the world no longer swallowed his narrative so easily. For Marcus, the trial was supposed to be an ending. Instead, it became a beginning he had never planned for. Civil rights organizations reached out, asking him to speak at rallies. Universities invited him to share his story with students. Colleagues who had once ignored him now looked at him with a strange mix of respect and guilt. The weight of expectation pressed on his shoulders. Clara was the first to notice. "You don't have to carry it all," she told him over coffee one evening. Her voice was steady, her eyes gentle but unyielding. "What you did, it matters. But you're not obligated to fix the whole world." Marcus smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe not. But if I stop now, doesn't it mean Harrington still wins?" Doesn't it mean all those years of silence were for nothing? Clara reached across the table, her hand brushing his. No, it means you've already lit a fire. And a fire doesn't need you to hold it forever, it spreads on its own. Still, Marcus could not rest. He attended meetings, he spoke to reporters, he shook hands with people who told him he gave them hope. Yet every word of praise seemed to deepen the silence he carried inside. He was not a savior. He was a man who had endured humiliation, and though justice had been served in court, he knew discrimination would not vanish with one verdict. Meanwhile, Harrington's fall grew steeper. Bankruptcy loomed, his wife filed for divorce, and old allies refused his calls. The empire that had seemed unshakable crumbled like sand underfoot. And yet, he clung to bitterness. In private conversations leaked to the press, he sneered about ingrates and witch hunts. The world had not humbled him. It had only cornered him. One evening, as Marcus walked home from a community meeting, he saw Harrington on a television screen in a store window. The man looked thinner, older, his eyes haunted. A reporter asked him if he regretted his words. Harrington paused, his jaw tight, then said, "Regret? My only regret is trusting people who couldn't handle the truth." Marcus stopped in his tracks. For a moment, rage surged through him, bitter and hot. But then, unexpectedly, he felt something else, pity. Harrington had been forced to his knees, yet he refused to rise as a better man. He was trapped, not by the court, but by his own pride. The realization shook Marcus. Justice was never just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing the wounds left behind. And he wondered how many wounds remained open, festering in silence. Days later, Marcus stood at a podium in front of hundreds. The room was filled with young people, many of them students of color, their eyes shining with a hunger for truth. He began his speech not with triumph, but with honesty. "I wish I could tell you that one verdict changes everything," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "I wish I could tell you that racism disappears when a courtroom declares it illegal. But it doesn't. What changes everything is user refusal to stay silent, our refusal to let dignity be stolen. I did not win alone. I stood because those before me taught me how. And now, it's our turn to carry that forward." The applause rose like a wave, but Marcus did not smile for the cameras. He smiled for himself, for his parents, for the ghosts of history watching from the shadows. Because he knew the story was no longer about Harrington's downfall. It was about the light that could spread when one man dared to fight. That night, Marcus finally slept without dreams. But in another part of the city, Harrington sat alone in a dim room, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. His empire was gone, his name tarnished, his allies vanished. For the first time, silence surrounded him, and he could not fill it with arrogance. He stared into the golden light of the setting sun, and for a fleeting moment, something like regret flickered across his face. But whether it was real or another mask, no one would ever know. And so, the story of two men diverged, one who found strength in justice, and one who drowned in his own pride. The world remembered the verdict, the fall, the fire of truth. But Marcus remembered something greater, the unbroken dignity of those who had been silenced too long. And he carried it forward, step by step, into a future where the golden light no longer crowned Kingsit illuminated everyone willing to stand. The weeks that followed carved themselves into Marcus's life like chapters written in fire. His name was no longer just Marcus Johnson. It became a symbol carried on banners, repeated in classrooms, whispered in homes where parents told their children to keep fighting. Each time his phone buzzed, it brought another request: come speak here, come lead this, come stand in front of the cameras one more time. He moved through crowds like a man walking under a spotlight he had not asked for. And though he wore a calm face, a quiet unease grew inside him. Because symbols do not get to rest. He tried to go back to work, to reclaim some rhythm of normalcy. Harrington was gone, removed from the company in disgrace, and the board bent over backward to prove they had reformed. But Marcus could feel the difference in the way people looked at him. Some with admiration, some with envy, and some with resentment sharp enough to cut. He could almost hear their thoughts: the reason Harrington fell. He's the reason everything changed. He's dangerous. On his second week back, a young intern stopped him in the hallway. Her voice trembled as she said, "Thank you. Tu never thought I'd see someone stand up to him. You gave me courage." Marcus smiled politely, but as he walked away, the weight of her words pressed down. Courage. Was that what this was? Or was it exhaustion disguised as victory? At night, he found himself staring at old photographs of his parents. His father, in his bus driver's uniform, lines of fatigue etched into his face. His mother, her hands worn from years of work, her eyes fierce with unspoken battles. They had endured a lifetime of quiet injustice. And here he was, expected to carry the torch into a storm that never seemed to end. Meanwhile, Harrington refused to disappear. Though his empire had crumbled, he found new allies in the shadows. Online forums lit up with defenders who called him a victim of cancel culture, a martyr for speaking truths others were too afraid to say. Videos surfaced of him speaking at private gatherings, his words sharper, uglier than before. He no longer wore the polished mask of corporate civility. Now he spoke openly, blaming people like Marcus for the fall of America. Marcus watched one of these videos late one night, the screen glowing cold in the darkness of his apartment. Harrington's voice was steady, filled with venom. They want to strip us of everything. Our businesses, our heritage, our right to speak the truth. And if we don't fight back, we'll be on our knees next. Marcus closed his laptop with a trembling hand. He realized then that humiliation had not destroyed Harrington, it had transformed him into something far more dangerous. A wounded man clinging to hatred can be more destructive than a king on his throne. The realization gnawed at Marcus. The court case had ended, but the war was far from over. And now, he was caught in it, whether he wanted to be or not. Clara noticed the change in him. One evening, she came by his apartment with takeout and a bottle of wine, insisting he needed a break. They sat on the floor, cartons scattered around them, the city humming outside. "You're burning out," she said, blunt as always. "I can't stop," Marcus replied, rubbing his temples. "Everywhere I look, he's still there. He's still poisoning people. If I walk away, it's like letting him win all over again." Clara leaned closer, her voice firm. "You don't have to chase his shadow. You've already dragged him into the light. Let the world see him for what he is. That's enough." Marcus shook his head. "It's not enough. He's rebuilding. And if we don't stop him, all of this of everything will be wasted." Clara studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Then don't do it alone. That's how he wins, making you believe this fight is yours to carry on your own." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. He thought of the voices who had joined him in the courtroom, of the people who had stepped forward once one man had dared to break the silence. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe the fight was not his alone. So Marcus began to build something new. He gathered those who had suffered under Harrington's reign, those who had felt invisible, silenced, dismissed. Together, they formed a coalition not just to expose discrimination, but to create change inside the system. They held workshops, demanded policy reforms, and built networks of support. Slowly, their fire spread, not from Marcus alone, but from many voices rising together. Still, Harrington's shadow loomed. His speeches grew more vicious, his following more fervent. Rumors swirled that he planned a return, not in business, but in politics, using resentment as his weapon. The thought chilled Marcus. What good was a courtroom victory if hatred simply found a new stage? One evening, Marcus was invited to a televised debate. The host promised it would be civil, a discussion on corporate reform and accountability. Marcus agreed, believing it was another step toward progress. But when he arrived at the studio, his breath caught in his chest. Richard Harrington was already seated at the opposite table. The cameras flickered on, the lights burning hot, and the nation watched as the two men faced each other again. "Mr. Johnson," Harrington said, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "still riding the wave of your 15 minutes of fame, I see." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "If standing up for dignity is fame, then I'll ride it as long as I have to." The debate ignited quickly. Harrington framed himself as the victim, claiming the court had punished him for speaking uncomfortable truths. Marcus countered with facts, reminding viewers of the evidence, the testimonies, the undeniable harm Harrington had inflicted. Back and forth they went, the tension coiling tighter with each exchange. And then Harrington snapped. "You people," he spat, his mask slipping in front of millions. Always playing the victim, always demanding more, never satisfied. You should be grateful we even gave you a seat at the table." The studio fell silent. Even the host froze, eyes wide with shock. The cameras captured everything: the sneer on Harrington's lips, the venom in his eyes. And in that silence, Marcus did something no one expected. He smiled, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Thank you," Marcus said softly, his voice steady. "Thank you for finally showing the world exactly who you are." The clips spread like wildfire. By morning, Harrington's last defense had crumbled. Sponsors cut ties. Even his most loyal supporters faltered, unable to excuse words so nakedly cruel. His attempt at a comeback had become his final undoing. Marcus, meanwhile, did not celebrate. He walked through the city streets that evening, the golden light of sunset bathing the skyline. Children laughed in the park, couples strolled hand in hand. Life pulsed with its messy, ordinary beauty. He breathed deeply, realizing that justice was not a moment in court or a headline on a screen. It was the quiet dignity of people living free from humiliation. And for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to hope. The viral clip of Harrington's televised outburst swept across the country like a tidal wave. His words, "You people, you should be grateful," were dissected, condemned, and replayed until they became a scar on the nation's conscience. Even those who had defended him were forced to confront the ugliness they had chosen to excuse. Politicians distanced themselves, corporate leaders issued statements, and universities used the clip as a case study in systemic prejudice. Overnight, Harrington transformed from a disgraced businessman into a permanent cautionary tale. For Marcus, however, the spotlight dimmed into something quieter, something almost unbearable. Strangers still stopped him on the street, thanking him, some even tearing up as they told him how much his courage meant. But behind their gratitude, Marcus sensed something else: expectation. They wanted him to be more than a man. They wanted him to be the eternal flame of justice. And Marcus knew no one could carry such fire forever without being consumed. One evening, as the golden sun melted behind the skyline, Marcus met Clara at a small diner tucked away from the city's chaos. She watched him stir his coffee without drinking it, his silence louder than any speech. "You don't have to keep proving yourself," she said gently. Marcus sighed, his eyes heavy. "That's the thing. I'm not proving myself. I'm proving that dignity isn't negotiable. And as long as people like Harrington exist, the fight never ends." Clara reached across the table, her hand covering his. "But Marcus, fights don't end, people do. You're allowed to live, too." Her words sank deep. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the courtroom, the cameras, the rallies. He thought of Harrington, kneeling on the courthouse steps, and of the millions who had watched that image with awe. And then he thought of his parents, who had asked for nothing more than to live with dignity. He realized then that his role was not to fight forever, but to make sure others could stand beside him, carrying the struggle forward together. So Marcus stepped back. He continued to work with the coalition, but he refused to be its only face. He encouraged others to lead, to speak, to rise. Slowly, the movement grew not around him, but beyond him. What began as one man's stand in a boardroom became a chorus too loud to be silenced. Meanwhile, Harrington's spiral reached its final depths. With his wealth drained by lawsuits, his properties seized, and his family gone, he retreated into obscurity. Reporters occasionally caught glimpses of him, a gaunt figure slipping into cheap motels, a man muttering in bars about conspiracies and betrayal. The golden light that once crowned him had vanished, leaving only shadows. He had been forced to his knees, and in his pride, he had chosen never to rise again. Years later, Marcus stood on another set of courthouse steps, but this time as a mentor to a younger man who had filed his own case against discrimination. The air was warm, the sky painted gold by the setting sun. Cameras clicked, crowds cheered, but Marcus did not stand in the center. He stood at the side, watching the next generation step forward. A reporter spotted him and rushed over. "Mr. Johnson, do you have any words today?" Marcus paused, the light reflecting in his eyes. Then he spoke simply, his voice steady. "Justice is not about one man's victory or another man's defeat. It's about making sure no one has to beg for their dignity. That's the work. That's the legacy." The reporter nodded, scribbling furiously. But Marcus was already walking away, blending into the crowd, just another face among many. And that, he realized, was the point. He was not a hero. He was a man who refused to be silent, and that refusal had sparked something greater than himself. As the golden light bathed the courthouse, Marcus looked up at the sky. He thought of his parents, of Clara, of the countless voices who had carried him when the weight was too much. He thought of Harrington, too, not with hatred, but with a strange, quiet pity. Because in the end, Harrington had chosen pride over redemption, bitterness over change. His kneeling had been forced. Marcus's, if ever it came, would be by choice an act of humility, of humanity, not defeat. And in that contrast lay the true victory. For justice was not in the courtroom alone, nor in the headlines that screamed of downfall and triumph. It was in the quiet dignity of lives lived free, in the courage passed from one generation to the next, in the golden light that belonged not to kings or tyrants, but to everyone who dared to stand. That was the story the world would remember. Not the arrogance of a man who fell, but the resilience of a people who refused to bow. And so, as the sun dipped low and the city hummed with ordinary life, Marcus walked forward calm, steady, unbroken into a future still burning with the promise of justice. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.